Hello and welcome to the second part of this tutorial. Today I would like to show you all functionalities, all features of this alternative firmware, and all what you see today you will also find in the manual on my website. It's available German and also English. I like manuals. I like to read the functionality of a module. And one important part we'll cover today is how to set steps. You have here a sequence and I like to set the steps. You are different possibilities to do that. Of course, you can just press the buttons here on the matrix. And you also have some functions you see on the right side. So let's take a look at these functions and let's stop the sequencer here now, so you see it a bit better. You have here the function set. I press this button here, and when I press it, you see here these mute buttons are lit. So that means that for these functions, these mute buttons have a different behavior. Whenever I press a button here, and whenever I enter a function, and you see the patterns or the mute buttons lighting up, then you know, okay, now these buttons have a special behavior. In this case, the behavior is whenever I press here this mute button, the track will not be muted, but this row, this complete track will be set. You see, the complete track is set. And this is also true for the delete function. I press here now delete. The mute buttons indicate you that they will have a different behavior, and now I can delete this complete row. When I press set and a button here on the matrix, this do not set the row but a column. So I can set here a complete column. It doesn't matter where you press, it's always the column you select. And so it's easy to add columns and steps for different instruments, for different tracks. This is also true for the delete function, so I can delete a complete column. Then we have here shift left and shift right. Again, I press shift left. I see the different behavior of the mute buttons. And when I press here, now nothing happens because it's nothing to shift. So I enter first some steps, let's say here and here. And if I press now shift and a track or a row, the complete steps are shifted to the left or to the right. So in this case to the left, and with right to the right. This is also possible for columns. So if I press shift left and I press here the button of a column of the matrix, the shift goes up, not to the left but up, and with shift right to down, it goes down. So this goes up and down. But this, as you've seen it before, pressing a button here, it's the column you select, and pressing one of the mute button is the row you select. And the same is true for invert. So I can invert a complete track. Or if the track is empty, all steps of course then are set. Or I can invert a column. Or I can swap. Swap means swap the first part and the second part of a row or a column. In this case I swap the row. You see, this part is now here and this part is then here. And I can also swap the first part of the column, the second part of the column, for instance here. So with these 6 functions you can manipulate, you can set and delete the steps on the matrix for this pattern you've selected. In this case, the first pattern, I manipulate only the first pattern in this case. It's also possible to live record the steps. So for that I first start the sequencer and I activate the function. It's called Note on this original panel. So I press Shift and Note because, well, Note has this black label. On my new panel this function is called Record, but it's the same function. So now whenever I press a button of the matrix, the whole column, where the playhead is, will be set. So I press here and you see wherever the playhead is, all the steps of the column are now set. When I select a row, a track, so when I play one of these mute buttons, only this step of this row will be set. For instance here, I press for the gimbal and only this steps here on this row will be set. You can quantize this recording. There's a system parameter where you can set that only, for instance, every 4th step should be set if you use this function. So it's easier to record precise the steps with this quantize function. Whenever you would like to enter rhythms, you can use Euclidean Rhythms. The function is called Effects. So I press Shift, Effects, and well, maybe you see now the LEDs indicating that the behavior of these buttons is different. So you see here now an empty matrix, and for each track you can now define different parameters. First of all, the length of this rhythm. For instance, we would like to have a pattern with 16 steps. I press this button here to indicate the length of this track should be 16. Then the fill rate is shown here. I have here the default 4 steps per track. So I have 4 steps here placed according this Euclidean rhythm algorithm. If I would like to have 5 steps, for instance, I press here this button, 6, 7, 8, and so on. This blinking LED indicates the length. So if I make a smaller pattern and I press here 12, this makes no sense because the length is only 8 and I can't fill a track with the length 8 with more than 8 steps. So I can change here the length to 16 again and then set the fill rate, for instance, to 10. I can also define the offset, so this pattern can, or this track, you can move this track 1 or 2 or 3 in one direction or the other direction, and you do that with these buttons here. They define the offset. So if you have, for instance, this simple track here, I can define an offset of 1, of 2, 3, of 4, then starts again. So this is the offset. And well, we can hear this track and start the sequencer. And now you hear the hi-hats. And if I change the fill rate, of course also this pattern will change. Then I have the possibility to also define the probability this step will be played. I do that with these buttons here. If I press here, the probability is 90%. And 80, 70, 60, 50, and so on. And with this setting here, the probability is only 20%. So even when I have a failure rate of 15 of the 60 steps, most of the steps will not be played because the probability is very, very low. If I click here again and I press it twice to indicate 100% is what I want, the same is true for offset. If I would like to remove the offset, I just press this button here again. The offset should be 0 then, and now all, in this case 15 steps, will be played always. We now just defined one track, but you can also define the second track just pressing here, and then all you see here, the bottom of this matrix, is then true for this track here. So again, I can set the length, in this case 8, the fill rate, and also the randomness, so the probability, and an offset. And so I have 6 tracks, the first 6 tracks I can manipulate and generate Euclidean rhythms. There's a nice button here, this button here generates automatically all these 6 tracks. Sometimes it sounds good, sometimes it doesn't sound so good. It's just random. And whenever I press this button, this whole pattern changes. So, how can you use now this pattern, this generated or entered by hand? How can you use this pattern? You have 2 ways to use it. The first way is you press this 7th button here, this mute button here. It's a very special button. When you press this and you remove this effects mode, you go back to the normal matrix, you will hear this Euclidean rhythm. You will still hear them because the background, they will be used. So this button here, this 7th button, is the play this rhythm in the background. If I switch this function off and I go back to my normal matrix, to my normal pattern, you do not hear this rhythm, only if you activate this background function with this button here. Okay, this is very convenient because you can then generate a simple Euclidean rhythm. For instance, when I remove all these random generated rhythms and I just place a simple by hand, let's say length is 16 and fill rate is 11, it's set as background rhythm, and if I go back now, I hear this rhythm and I can add my own pattern on top of this Euclidean rhythm. So I have like 2 layers, a background layer, and the funny thing is in this background layer you also have this random effect or this probability. So in this case not all hi-hats will be played, but only I think 40%. And so I can add this background, this randomized background, with my own steps. The second way to use this Euclidean rhythm is simpler. So I delete first this manually entered pattern. I go back to my Euclidean rhythm. Very simple here. Let's add a second track. For instance, for the timbal, I would like to have a fill rate of 2, no offset, very, very simple. And now I'd like to copy this pattern to my pattern. So this is easy. I can now just press one of these buttons here and copy what you see here to the pattern 1 to 8. For instance, I copy to the pattern 8, pressing this button here. It looks like before, but now these steps are set on my pattern. They are not part of this effects screen. You see the effect screen is still the same, but these patterns, these steps, are now copied to my pattern, and I can of course manipulate them here and change them. So this is a really easy way to create simple rhythms and then copy them to your patterns. Let's do it again. First I delete this pattern number 1. You see pattern number 1 and pattern number 2, pattern number 3 are empty. Then I go to this effects screen. I try to generate a nice rhythm without randomness, with a bit of offset here, and then I copy this to pattern number 1 or 2 or 3. In this case I copy to pattern number 2, and I'm back and see the pattern number 2, pattern number 1, pattern number 3 are still empty, but pattern number 2 is now filled by the steps of the Euclidean rhythm. Another way to enter steps is using the library included. My wife is a professional drummer and she made a small library of rhythms, and the function is called, well, Midi USB. So on my panel the name is library, but on the original panel it's called Midi USB. So when I enter this function, I see here, like we've seen in the function effects for the Euclidean rhythm, the first 6 tracks are musically, so this is the rhythm, and with the 7th and the 8th track you select these rhythms. I start the sequencer and you hear now this rhythm. With the 7th row you select the type of rhythms, so rock or more trance or whatever. And for each of this type, of this genre, my wife then made some rhythms, and you select the rhythms with this 8 row. So for this type of music you have then different rhythms here in the library. As we've seen before with the button here, with the mute button, you can randomly select a rhythm. So the type and also the rhythm itself is then randomly selected. And maybe it's an inspiration for you and to hear some of the rhythms. And if you like them, as before, pressing one of the pattern buttons will copy the steps of this rhythm to your pattern. So when I press here now the pattern 1 button, I leave the function, the library function, and I see just now the pattern, and these first 6 tracks then are copied to my pattern. Maybe you're asking yourself, is it possible to use the functions, Euclidean rhythm, also the library, when you play live? And because you do not want to hear the audience, your selection or your creating of the rhythm. And the answer is yes. It's a system parameter called live rehearsal, and when this parameter is active you hear what you're doing, so you've seen it before, But when you switch off this parameter, you can choose, for instance, a pattern of the library, or also in Euclidean rhythm, and the audience will not hear how you are working, how you are elaborating this pattern. A second parameter is called copy all, and this parameter indicates if you copy only the steps of a pattern or also the track informations, for instance the length. Another way to generate steps is very easy. This is the copy function. If I have a pattern and I activate Shift Copy, I can copy this pattern to another pattern. So for instance, the pattern 1 is now active and I copy this pattern to pattern 8. You will see pattern 8 is now the same as pattern 1. This is a very simple function. We have now seen how to enter steps. And until now, all steps were just triggers. But the a157b can much more than that. One gate mode, so one way to give out the steps, is a trigger, of course. But we have other so-called gate modes. We can use this function gate mode and also gate length to decide what the output of a track should be. When I activate this function, you see the first time the touch screen I mentioned in the first tutorial. You see now here a number 1 and then here 2 letters T and R. So T and R stands for trigger, and 1 means the first track, so the first row here is a trigger. I can press now these buttons here to change the track. 2, 3, I hope you see it here, a small 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 1 again. And I can also press here to change the gate mode of this track. For instance, I can change the gate mode of track number 3. And this gate mode here now then decides what the output of these steps, the output of this track will be. Some of the gate modes has an additional information you see in this gate length function. For instance, here, if the gate mode is trigger, the gate length indicates the length in milliseconds of this trigger. So the default is 4, but I can change this and say, no, I would like to have an output of 9 milliseconds, for instance, or just 1. So these functions are together. So gate length is like a parameter of the gate mode. For instance, for the second gate mode swing, this parameter here is in percent the swing, so the delay of every second step. 15%, 10%, 5%, 45%, or the default is 20%. Then we have another gate mode. This is envelope discrete. So when I go now to gate length, I see here indicated like a small envelope, and if I press here, I can enter the envelope and I can change it. I can draw my own. And this envelope here then will be output for this track. Whenever a step is set, this envelope at a short time will then be output. This is a discrete envelope, so it's exactly these points, these values here, these voltages, and this second type here is a smooth envelope. You can also enter the envelope, it's like the same, or you can enter an envelope for yourself, but the output is smoothed. So it's not like these discrete values, these fixed values, 1 volt, 2 and 3, but it's a smooth envelope, a smooth curve. Then we have here a classical gate out. So in this case, there's no parameter, it's just 50% of the clock duration is high and the second 50% is low. Then we have high. In this case, the whole 100% is high, so it's not a trigger. It's like always high when the step, of course, is active, is set. And then we have some very special gate modes. The first is routing. We'll talk about it later. So you can route a step, and this step then activates an activity. It's like these function keys I mentioned in the first tutorial, but in this case a step activates an activity. Not a button here or input, but a step itself. So a step can decide, please sequencer, stop now. This is called routing. And then we have many performance gates. There's a performance fader, key, button, and these are very special functions, so you can then like perform with these little buttons and activate external devices, for instance. These are the gate modes. The gate modes define how is the output, what will a step do exactly. So I think we should now try out some of these gate modes. Maybe you remembered last time we connected track number 7 and track number 8 to this mini synthesizer voice from Töpfer. I would like to mute first this track number 8, and so we just hear track number 7. It's now just a trigger, and we can change here the length of this trigger. So it's track number 7, it's the gate mode trigger. We can change the length, but I think it's only a small difference. We can also change this to the swing. Then here's the swing effect, 5% in this case. And I hope you hear the difference. 5% again. But I think for this a normal gate out is better. So this is a classical gate, so 50% of the length of the step is high and the other 50% is low. Now we can also activate the pitch. So now this track number 8 controls the pitch, the frequency. It's always high whenever it's set. So I can change this. And it's also a trigger now. And it's also a trigger. We can change this to another gate mode, for instance high. So in this case, when the step is set, the level is high, the voltage is high, and when it's not set, it's low. We will later tune the steps, so you can't not just decide between high and low, but you can decide exactly what is the frequency, what is the note of this step. But well, for now it's just high and low. We have here an other gate mode, envelope smooth. And here now I can draw the frequency. So you see this peak. This is envelope smooth and envelope discrete. So this is useful when the output should be like a chord, something with very clear voltage level. But in this case, for a frequency, it's maybe better you have this frequency curve. And so this is the smooth. So we can draw here your curve. So we have here another gate mode, this routing. We will cover this later in the tutorial, but now I would like to show you these performance modes. These are very special gate modes, and these gate modes do not use the sequencer, so I can stop the sequencer, and they do not use the steps. You will see why. I first choose track number 8 and I say this track number 8 should be in the gate mode performance fader. When I do that, I have here like a small fader. You see that? You can change the voltage level of this output from maximum to minimum, like it would be a fader. So, but I now need for the track number 7, this is fader, this is okay, track number 7, another performance mode, for instance click or maybe better button. When I now place this fader here, I can use this row as button, you see. Independent of the fader, the frequency is different. This is the button. We also have like a click. Now when I click this button, there's a very short click. This nice effect here. And we also have here an effect, well, like a latch, so I can press here and then keep pressed. I can change here with this fader the frequency. And I can also use for this fader like a small keyboard. This is not a gate mode, this is performance keyboard. Well, so it's like a button, but with different voltage level. Not just on off, but it's like a keyboard, a different level for voltage. And this is the on off element here. Well, now I have no gate, and now the gate is active. Yes, these are the performance modes. A track is defined by the gate mode and the gate length, but also by the first step and the last step per track and the direction. We will use here this track number 2 and start the sequencer. And so to set the first step is very easy. You just press first and then the step of this track. That should be the first step. And you see now the playhead moves from the first step to the last step. In this case it starts again. The last step is set with this last function and then you press the step and again now the play goes from the first to the last. For the direction you have 4 buttons, forward, backward, pendulum and random, and you see also the direction with these LEDs. 2 LEDs at the beginning indicates this is a forward track. In this case all 8 tracks are just forward default, and I can press here backwards and then for instance select my second step. I can press one of these buttons here or also the mute button. And then I see the 2 last LEDs are active, and this means this is now a backward track. Pendulum track, again press one of the buttons of this row of this track, has 2 LEDs here and 2 LEDs here, and you see now the playhead goes back and forth and back and forth. And finally the random walk. If I activate random walk, you only see 1 LED here and 1 LED here, and this is now random walk. So the probability is 25% for the playhead to go forward, it's 25% to stay where it is, and 25% to go backwards. So finally the playhead moves forward, but in an interesting way. So we can now try out this effect. First I set the first step and let's say the last step here. So only the first 8 steps of this track will be part of this small pattern, of this melody. And then I say, okay, the second track is random walk, and the first track is pendulum. You see now, the first track, the playhead goes back and forth, back again and forth, and here this is a random walk and only the first 8 steps are covered by the playhead. If I go back to the sequencer or the pattern, I see now the same. I can set now here the steps. And here the effect of this first and last and direction per track. Okay, we have seen now different ways to define a track. We can set the gate mode, the gate length, the first and the last step, and also the direction. And we can also add a clock divider per track. This clock divider defines how many clock signals are needed to move the playhead one position. So if the clock divider is 4, you need 4 clock signals to move the playhead of this track one step. So that's it. The new firmware allows you to use up to 5 external clocks, independent external clocks. You can use function 1 to function 4, these input sockets, and assign then these clocks to tracks. But most of the time you don't need that. You just can work with this clock divider. So let's do that. We go to the clock function, and you see here now 4 LEDs indicating that we have here like a special behavior for these 4 buttons. With the first button here, we can set the clock dividers. So for track number 1, the clock divider is now 1, also 1, 1, 1. And if I press here this button here, for instance, the clock divider now is 4. It would be 8, 12, 9, 4. And if we start now the sequence with some steps here, you see this playhead moves slower than the other ones because the clock divider is 4. So we can change the clock divider for each step here, each track here, and you will see now we have completely different playheads. This one is slower, and this is very slow, and these are fast. So we have different clock divider and different playheads for each track. To reset the clock divider is very easy. You just push the first button here, and now all playheads has the same speed, but we have to reset the playheads to be in sync again. Well, until now we always used the external clock. So when we go to the second page here, to the second sub-function here of clock, we see here external. If we start the sequencer and we remove the external clock, the sequencer stops. We can also use the internal clock just by pressing here this touch screen and change the external to the internal clock. I'm not sure if you see this touch screen, the video, very well. In reality, if you work with the module, it's not so bad, but maybe you see the video not so good. Now you should see here an int for internal. And when you press here, the touch screen is an X for external. And when you would like to have both signals, you can click here and you see both. So now we have the external clock and the internal clock. So now we have the internal clock. You see in the sequence, when I remove this cable here, nothing happens. Because now the internal clock is working and has control over the sequence. With the third page here, you can set the speed of this internal clock. Now it's 120. you can click here these numbers to change the speed. Now it's 220, 20, and 120 again, 130, 110. Of course, the clock divider also work together with this internal clock. So when we have the internal clock and the clock divider is now active, this clock divider is also used for the internal clock. So sometimes you have an external clock and also an internal clock, and they have to be in sync. And well, this is not so easy for the A157 because we only have an internal clock here for the processor, and this clock is precise, but not so precise. And so I programmed here a possibility to calibrate this internal clock, this processor clock, and an external very precise clock like from Pamela's workout. If you have here an external clock plugged in, you see in this upper part of the screen the speed, the beat per minute, the system thinks the external clock has. In this case, the firmware thinks the external clock is 120.2 or 3. You see, 120.2 or 3. It's not precise 120. Well, it is precise 120. The Pamela workout is a very precise clock, but the processor clock is not precise enough to see that. And so the processor clock thinks, okay, I think it's 120. Now we have here 3 buttons to calibrate the internal clock. It's very easy. You just press the lower or the upper button, and so long you see exactly 120 or 120 well and something. And now the internal processor clock is calibrated, so now it's exactly the same speed internally as externally. And when you have now different devices, some with the internal and all with the external clock, now it's precise. You can reset this calibration by pressing this center button here. It's like a 0, and when I press here, the calibration is resetted. And I can calibrate it again. So I press so long, up or down. You see here 120 and precise 120. And now the internal clock and the external clock is in sync. You cannot only define the behavior of a track, but also of a step, of each step. So not just the gate mode is defining the output, but also a function called set. Well, on the original panel this function is called accent. So I press Shift and accent. But accent is only a part of this sculpturing of a step. The first subfunction is the accent. So I press here the first LED or the first mute button, and this LED now indicates we are in the first subfunction of this set. This is accent. So when I press now here a button, the behavior of the matrix is more or less as before. I have here the first pattern selected, and I enter now the steps for the first pattern. But if I press a button twice, it is blinking, and this blinking indicates that the output now is accent with accent. If I press it again, the LED is cleared, and I can so accent some steps. For instance, this gimbal, maybe hear it, has now the first step has an accent, and the second and third steps, the output is normal. So the normal output voltage is 5, and the accented output voltage is 10. You can change the settings in the system parameter, and well, some modules can accept these different voltage levels and you hear the difference. But other modules, for instance here, the bass drum, do not react to these different voltage levels. And for that, for instance, if I press here to accent, I don't think you have a big difference. And for this kind of modules, you need, as I indicated in the first tutorial, you need a second track, and with this second track, then you can accent the step with a most special input socket of this module. Then you can give an accent. But other modules work with these different voltage levels, and for these modules it's very easy to set this accent. Just press the button twice, the LED is blinking and the output is higher, the voltage level of the output is higher, and so you hear an accent. The second subfunction of this set function is roll. So I press here the second button of this subfunction menu, and now again I can just press the steps. But if I press the button twice, you hear a roll effect. And if I press the button 3 times, the roll effect is even stronger. And I can press it also 4 times. And you also see the blinking changes, so a faster blinking indicates the roll effect is 4, 3, 2, or well, just 1, no roll effect, so it's just the output as you know it before. For the third function, I would like to slow down the clock because it's difficult to hear with this fast clock. So I go to the clock menu, and we use right now the internal clock. So I reduce the beat per minute to 20, so it's really slow. And I also would like to zoom in. I click here last and I set the last step to the 4th step for all tracks. And so that means now we only hear the first 4 steps. So let's go back to this step menu and to the third subfunction. This is called flame. So it is the same as the flame effect, the drum set. And if I press the button once and I enter here also a gimbal as reference, you just hear the step as before. And if I press it twice, I have a flame effect, and so the output is a 1/8 length of the step later. It's delayed. Here, first comes the gimbal, and then the bass drum. You can change this delay to 1/4 of the step length if you press the button twice, and now you will hear the effect a bit better. Or you can press the button 3 times, and then you have also the delay 1/4, but additionally the output is normal also on top of that at the beginning. So the normal step, and on top of that a flame effect. It's possible to add the roll effect to the flame effect, or the flame effect to the roll effect. So you can use them together. If, for instance, I have here a roll effect of 1/8, so 12.5% delay, I can go back to the roll subfunction and add here a roll, let's say 3 times. So you have a delay, and then these 3 rolls, or these 3 triggers after that. This is now the effect with the clock 120. Okay. If you see a lot of how do you say, playheads and a lot of steps and everything is blinking and you're a bit confused, I understand you very well. There is an easy way to solve this problem. You just press the function button, this mute button here, and then you only see the steps. And you can then change the steps and you do not see the playhead. So if you press this function button, this sub-function, then the playhead will be invisible. Okay, let's reset the last step of these tracks, and then we have a fourth way to sculpture the steps, probability. So when I activate this sub-function, again, I can enter here the normal steps as we seen before. For pattern number 1, I entered here this brace term. But now, when I press twice, the probability is only 70%. These steps will be output. And if I press the button twice, you see the blinking is a bit faster, then the probability is 40%. And the last level of probability is 10%. So now the output of these steps is dependent of the probability. And of course you can also use this method to set the probability of your accent level. Well, not of the accent level of this function set accent, but if you use this additional track to indicate the accent. So we can use this fourth track here and output now this step with different probabilities, of course, but also with different accents. As I mentioned in the first part of the tutorial, it's also possible to output the exact voltage of a step. So the note, the pitch, not just 5 or the normal voltage or the accented voltage, but exactly the voltage of a note. This is only possible for track number 7 and track number 8. So, but before we do that, we have to set up the gate modes for these tracks, because if I just output the step as it is here, you hear the default is a trigger output, the default gate is trigger, and this is not so convenient for now this type of usage. So I get to the gate mode, I go to the gate mode, and first I change the gate mode of the gate. It's not, let's take here the gate mode gate, and then we change the gate mode of this pitch information steps. And for that, well, that also sounds really funny, but for that we choose the gate mode high. The gate mode high outputs the same voltage for the whole step duration. Okay, so now we can go to this accent or step function, and with the button number 6 here I can now define the output, the voltage of each of these steps. So let's try that. I go to this function here, and now you see a different screen. Now you see here the buttons as before. So these buttons here in the row 7 and 8 indicates the steps of the row of the track number 7 and 8. And here you see like information what voltage would be output and 2 arrows, arrow up and arrow down. But I think it would be easier to start with an empty pattern. So let's go back, delete, let's delete all steps, stop the sequencer, reset the sequencer, and let's start now from the beginning. Now see here a blinking LED, and this LED indicates that the information you see here at the top, this is the information for this step here. So in this case, this step here will output octave number 0 and note C. Well, this is 0 volt. This is output nothing. I can change this output. When I press here this number, this octave number, I change it from 0 to 1, and now the output would be 1 C, so the note C for the first octave. And so I can change the octave, and of course I also can change the note. C, C sharp, this indicates a sharp sign, D, D sharp, and so on, F, G, B, and C again. Well, now the C from the second octave. With these two arrows I can set the normal voltage, this means voltage out, and this means this is just a step. If I go now to another subfunction of this step menu, I see this is just a step. If I just add a step, we can do it here, of course, it's the same. I can also give this step an accent, and when we go now back to this tune menu, I see here this is an accent output. So what you see here is voltage A for voltage accent. Go back, I remove the accent, just a normal step, and now we see voltage output. So voltage A for accent, this means this is for instance 10 volt out, and voltage O is 5 volt, but not tuned, just an output. To tune it, I can press here, as you've seen before, define the octave and define the note. With these arrows here, I can set the step to the normal level, the output level, or if it's an octave, an accented step, to the accented output, or I can delete the step. Delete is the same as set to octave 0 C. So I can here define the different output voltages of this step. In this case, the step number or the track number 7 should just output the normal voltage, because this is our gate. The track number 8, this is the pitch, and this element here we would like to manipulate. So let's do that. I press here, I say for instance I would like to output here a C to voltage 1, and here an E, an F, and a G. And this is how it sounds. Maybe here we have here a tuned output. You hear now notes. Can change this note here. This is one way to enter the notes. You can press one of these buttons, see the exact voltage or note of this output here, and change it with this touchscreen. So with these buttons you reset the step, or you set the step to the normal value, or you set the octave and the note. This is one way. There's another way, maybe a more convenient way. For this other way you press button number 7 or 8, and so you can see an overview of all steps of the track number 7 and 8. Let's do that for track number 8. I press this button here, and now I see the screen like the first octave, or the octave number 0. So all the steps here are octave 0, C. In this case now, I resetted all steps. This is now Walter 0. This row here is D. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B and C again. If you would like to enter a note in between, for instance a C sharp, just press these two buttons. This is a C sharp, so this is a C, this is a D, and this is a C sharp. If you see both LEDs, then it's a C sharp. This is also true for D sharp, and E sharp does not exist, it's not possible, but an F sharp, and so on. This is the way to enter these notes in between. If you would like to enter another octave, just press this button here for the track, and then you can scroll. If you press a button here in the second part of the screen, you jump to the next octave, and you go back with by pressing a button in this upper part. So you can like scroll through the different octave screens. When you see an LED blinking, that means in this upper octave are set steps. For instance, here you see this LED blinking. It just means here we have steps. If you would like, or if I press here and set these steps to this, in this octave, this is now octave 1, and I think the note would be, what is this? This is a G. And I go now to the first screen, so the octave 0. Then you see here the blinking LEDs indicating, okay, down here we have steps. And so you can output tuned steps. Okay, I think I should add here a little disclaimer, because the precision of the output of the a157 is not very high. It's just an 8-bit digital analog converter, and so if you use this tunes output for instance, volume information, it's no problem. But if you use it to provide a pitch to an oscillator, maybe the precision is not so precise, and maybe a note then is not exactly, for instance, a C or a D or the E. And you can solve this problem. You can use a quantizer, just a simple quantizer like the A156 from Töpfer is okay. Or you can calibrate the outputs. So then maybe you do not have the precision over the whole span of, let's say, 4 or 5 octaves, but for 1 octave it should be okay then. I will show you later how you can do that. And there is a third way you can use MIDI output. For that you need this small module here, this simple module here, with Midi Out. And if you use this module, I will show you how this works. Start here the sequence again. And now I will remove this pitch information and add this cable now to a Midi Out. Well, until now you do not hear a pitch. We have to activate the MIDI module. For that we go to the system function with Shift System, And here we have two MIDI settings. The first MIDI setting is called just MIDI, M-E, MIDI. And with this button here, with this touch screen here, I can activate MIDI. And now you hear the pitch again, without using the cable here. Now it goes over the MIDI cable to my MIDI or my MIDI to CV converter, and then this cable here comes then to this VCO frequency input of this MIDI synthesizer voice. I have here a submenu. Well, I have here two buttons. This small 0 button is like MIDI reset. Maybe you know this function from other tools. It's useful to reset all MIDI informations. And here I have like a submenu, a button, and here I can set up the MIDI out parameter. So per track I can say what should this module do. For track number 1, this is the default. It outputs the note 42. I'm not sure, but I think many drum synthesizer has this as, I think, as hi-hat. Then for track number 2, I have here the note 45 or 46. And these notes are on the channel 10 for the drums. Normally we use MIDI channel 10. So whenever you see a note like 46 or 42, it means this is the note 46 for channel 10. 36 and 37. And the last two I've defined a bit different. So in this case I have defined track number 7 as C1. This means channel 1. And in this case the output is not just one note like in a MIDI drum. Here the output is a note depending on the tuning. So depending on the note you entered with this step function where you tune the steps. I can change here the channel, C1, C2, C3, 4, 5, 6, and when you do not see a C here in front, this means now the note on the channel 10. So in this case, track number 7 would output the note 20 to 0 on the channel number 10. Let's go back. This is now for the track number 7, C1. But well, we only use the output for the track number 8. Now in this case you see the cable of track number 7 is still here, and for track number 8 in this case I used channel 2. So when I change this, we lost the frequency information because now I go to the channel number 1 and my MIDI to CV converter is configured for listen to channel number 2. With this button here I can go back to this main system parameter menu. We have a second menu system parameter, and this is called MC for clock. And with this button here, 1 and 0, 0, 1, I can change the output of the MIDI clock. So it's pretty easy. Just output the MIDI clock, yes or no. Now I would like to talk about the maybe most interesting part of the software about sequencing. Until now we just entered step for patterns. So here's the pattern 1 active, you can enter here some hi-hats. Then I change to pattern 2. Now I see a pattern 2. This LED indicates we are now in pattern 2. And this blinking LED here shows you the playhead is still in pattern 1, or the playheads. So I enter here some timbales, and I change to pattern 3 to enter some bass drums. If now I start the sequencer, it will start playing pattern 1 and then it changes to pattern 3, because in the standard mode, the playheads always go there where the visible pattern is. So if I change to pattern 1, I have to wait a bit, and then the playhead is also in pattern 1 and you hear pattern 1. If you like to jump immediately to the new pattern, you press the button twice and then you go immediately there. So, okay, well, of course we can sequence now manually. We can press these pattern buttons and then go from one pattern to the other. Maybe if you play live this is useful, but the sequencer can a lot more. For that, I think the most important button here in this new software is this AB button, or in my panel it's called multi. With that I can switch to the sequencer mode or the song mode. In this mode, the sequence of the patterns is not defined by what you press here, but by 3 functions: by loop, chain and repeat. So whenever you press this button here, this AB button, the sequencing of the patterns, not of the steps, the step sequence as you've seen it before, the sequencing of the patterns is defined by these 3 functions. So let's start with the loop function. I press here Shift Loop, and now I see in this screen one row here means a pattern. So in this case the first row is the first pattern, the second row is pattern number 2, 3 and so on. In chain, loop and repeat, this is true. A row means a pattern. In this case here, in this loop function, we see now a blinking LED here, so the playhead is here in pattern number 1. We also see it here. And if we start the sequence, this pattern sequencer sequence 1 pattern after the other, and because the LED is immer here in this first row, we only hear pattern number 1. We can change that. We can press here buttons on this matrix to show the sequencer what pattern should play. Now it plays pattern number 2, pattern number 1 again, pattern number 1. It goes from left to right, and at the end it goes back to the first pattern here. So you see the blinking LEDs, and these blinking LEDs indicate here we have a playhead. I have built in here a convenience function. If you press these buttons here, these buttons here do not mean the pattern because it doesn't make sense here. This button helps you to generate a nice loop. So if you press the second button here, you have a loop with pattern number 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 and so on. If you press the button 3 here, there's a very simple loop 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Let's switch the music on, and you see now 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I can enter very simple patterns with this convenient function. But let's improve this loop a bit. And this is one function that defines, well, I think the most important function that defines the sequence of patterns. Then we have another function called repeat. Let's try out. Here again, one row means a pattern. Pattern number 1, pattern number 2, pattern number 3. And this LEDs here indicates how often a pattern should be played when loop, or we see it later, chain says, hey, now this pattern, you have to play this pattern now. In this case, how often should this pattern be played? Just once? Or, for instance, 4 times. Now I say pattern number 2, always when loop or chain says pattern number 2 should be played, will be played 4 times. And again, you see here, as always, a blinking LED shows you here you have a playhead. So, if you go now back to the loop function, whenever you see here the LED on this pattern number 2, it will stay pretty long there because it will be played 4 times. It's really fast. It was really fast here in this pattern number 3, but it stays long here. Repeat 4 for this pattern. Here again, repeat 4 for this pattern. And now it goes to pattern number 1, only once, and here, and back to the beginning of this pattern sequence. So this is the second function defining the sequence of the patterns. Repeat. I think this is very convenient because often you have songs where patterns will be repeated 4 or 8 or 12 times. And so you can enter here once, and then in the loop function you just can, well, it's easier then to manage these sequences, these songs. The third function is called chain. As I mentioned before, chain and loop and repeat together define the sequence of the patterns. Let's take a look at the chain function. The chain function is useful when you play live. Here again, row number 1 is pattern number 1, row number 2 is pattern number 2, and so on. And here it is, if you press here a button, this goes into the chain, and the chain will then be played, and if this pattern was played, it is like done. If I press here once, twice, 3, now you will, hopefully you hear, it plays this pattern 2, then after playing it, the LED stops. I can press 1, 2, 3, 3, 3, 2, 2, 2, and it plays the pattern you indicate here, and then the patterns here, or these LEDs, or this indication, this will be removed. This chain overrides loop. So we have here a loop, and this loop is great. But whenever I enter something in a chain, also empty patterns, let's wait till this empty pattern will be played. The loop does not stop, but this chain has priority, and after finishing the chain, the loop takes place again, takes control again. So this loop is always active. Chain overrides the loop, or overrides the wrong word. It inserts into the loop these patterns you'd like to play live. So I think very convenient. You have a loop prepared, sounds great, with the repeats. Good. Then you activate this chain function. You just enter some patterns, perform, and after this performance is finished, the loop will become active again. You can change an existing chain, by pressing these LEDs again. Let's try this. Let's say I have here a chain and I made a mistake. I can press here now these LEDs, these buttons here, and remove them again. So without being played, these patterns then will be removed from this chain. When you think this is complicated, I made a mistake explaining it because I think it's easy. So if you are in the non-multi mode, in the normal mode, you see and hear the patterns. You can prepare the patterns. You can work on the patterns and improve them. Then the next task is to bring these patterns in a sequence. For that you go in this AB or in the multi-mode. I think you will see later why this mode is called multi-mode. But for now you go in this multi-mode, and now the repeat, the loop and the chain will take control. If the chain is empty, loop decides what pattern will be played together with repeat. So every LED here says this pattern should be played, and repeat says how often. If something is in the chain, if you entered something live, this chain then will have higher priority and the patterns of this chain will be played. Again, repeat indicates how often and the chain indicates which pattern. If the chain is empty, again, then the loop takes control and you hear this loop as it is. What comes now is a bit complicated. But until now, the playheads of the different tracks are always in the same position. In this case, you see it's position 1. And this is not always true. This do not have to be true always when you work with different track lengths. If the first or the last step for the different tracks are not in the same position, or if you work with clock dividers, or if you work with different external clocks triggering tracks, then the playhead is not always in the same position. I would like to show you this. I go to the clock and I add a clock divider for the bass drum and I start the sequencer. And now you will see this playhead is moving slow and the other playheads are moving faster. And when I look at the patterns, I see I have a playhead now here and here, or here and here, so the playheads are not in the same pattern. Now, one system parameter helps the system to decide what pattern you would like to see. Of course, you can always press a pattern and then you see this pattern, no problem. But as you see here, it's also possible that the pattern changes automatically and shows you automatically the most important pattern. And the system parameter is called follow track. With follow track you can decide what pattern should be shown. If the playhead is in different patterns, this follow track decides what pattern will be displayed here in the matrix. You can switch off this functionality just leaving this follow track empty. And in this case you always see the pattern you pressed here. But with follow track you see always the pattern with this follow track, with the playhead of the follow track. Then if you have different playheads, you also see in, for instance, the loop function, different blinking LEDs. Well, of course, because this blinking LEDs indicates where is a playhead. In this case I have a playhead here, for instance the bass drum, and a playhead here, for instance the cymbal, the hi-hat, and they are playing both their notes for their tracks, their steps for their tracks. And the same is true for the repeat. Now, well, I do not have a repeat effect here, I can enter it, and you see now here I have a playhead, but I also here I have a playhead, and these are the different playheads of these tracks. And the system will cover all this functionality automatically. So we'll decide what pattern and what track and so on and so on. So I think this works pretty good. And there's one thing more. Well, let's stop the sequencer for a second. And there's one thing more. Especially when you have different playheads and different clock dividers and so on, you would like to have more control about what is played here. And also, sometimes you have tracks that are really easy. You don't need 2 or 3 patterns for this track, but they are really easy. For instance, this case here, you just have a hi-hat. You just have a hi-hat and you would like to play this hi-hat again and again and again. You do not enter this hi-hat for every pattern. It's okay, you enter it once. And for these cases, with the special cases maybe, I programmed a mixed mode. So this mixed mode allows you to decide per track what is the behavior per track. In the original panel, this function is called ABCD. In my panel it's called mixed, but it's the same function of course. And if I activate this function, then you see the touchscreen again and you can decide for each track what should be the behavior. And well, now in this case, track number 1 has the behavior multi. Maybe you see it, an M and a U, multi. This is the standard behavior we've seen before. Multi means loop, repeat and chain. So track number 1 will now has this multi behavior. Track number 2 and so on has this multi behavior because this is the default. So we activated multi, well, multi. But we can change it. We can say, okay, track number 1 should always play pattern 1, independently of loops and repeats and chain and whatever. As I said, for instance, we have a very, very simple pattern for this track number 1, for instance, a hi-hat, and then you say, play just pattern number 1. Whatever loop says to you, play number 1 is good for me. This is only true for track number 1. You can also choose another pattern, of course. You can choose the follow track. For instance, we would like to say track number 2 should always play the same pattern as the follow track. We defined this follow track in the system parameters. And here now we just say follow track is so important, track number 2 should always play this follow track. This is the second option, or the third option. So we have follow track, we have multi, defined by loop, chain and so on, and a fixed pattern. In the third part of the tutorial, I will show you some cases where this mixed sequencing functionality is useful. So, let's recover these 2 or 2.5 modes. If the multi-mode is off, if you do not see this LED, the patterns will not be sequenced. The pattern will be played, and as you indicate by these buttons, that's it. If you activate this multi-mode, the sequencing of the patterns is done by loop, repeat and, most of the time live, chain, where you can insert UIDs. With this mixed mode ABCD in the original panel, you can very precise define per track how this multi or what pattern or follow track and so on. And finally, if you have playheads on different patterns because you have used a clock divider or different clocks or different track length, the system should cover all these special cases pretty well. Okay, that's about sequencing of patterns. You can assign these function buttons here and also the corresponding input sockets to so-called activities. You do that with the function activity and activity track on the new panel, or MISC1 and MISC2 on the original panel. So let's do that. I choose this screen here to assign these function buttons F1, F2, F3, F4 to an activity. One activity is mute, so let's try that. But first I have to decide the target of this activity. So in my case I would like to say this activity has a target track 1. I can here choose another track and also A for all tracks. But let's choose track number 1. So now when I start the sequencer, I hear the hi-hats, and whenever I press this function button, this activity will be activated and mute track number 1. Another activity is step, generate steps. I choose here track number 3, our bass drum, as target, and now whenever I press this function 1 button, steps will be generated on the fly. Then we have here roll. This is the same roll effect we have seen before. So we can here decide how many rolls, how intense the effect should be. 8, well, 4, 3, 2, let's say 3. The target here is again track number 3. And so when we start now the sequencer and activate this function, we hear nothing, of course. We have to set steps for this track, and now we hear this roll effect for the steps. Then we have here an activity called effects. It's the same effects we've seen before. So these Euclidean rhythms. So you can define them as you've seen before. Here is the preview. So you define here the length. Let's say 16. Then here the fill rate. As you've seen it before, the offset, the probability. And that's it. And then, of course, we have again to decide what should be the target of this effect. 3, our bass drum. And when we start now the sequencer, we first just hear these 2 bass drums here, but when we press function 1, then we hear the effect. So this rhythm. Isn't it cool? So we have 4 effects. You can assign 4 different effects and activate them just pressing one of these function keys. The next effect is pattern change. So whenever you press function 1 or you have an incoming signal, this socket here, the next pattern is selected. So when I press, well, let's assign this to all tracks. So for all tracks the pattern should change. So when I press now this function 1, you see here the next pattern will then be activated. Or the previous pattern. This is the next effect here. So if I press now function 1, then I go back. So you see? Well, the last effect is clock. It's a bit special. This effect allows you to assign an additional external clock. We are now working with the internal clock. And we could also use an external clock. But this activity allows you to assign an additional external clock, a second, a third, a fourth. And for one special track. For instance, now I would like to assign a clock for track number 3. And I have prepared here Pamela's workout, and this clock has 100 beats per minute. And when I add the clock signal here, so, and I reset the sequencer, you see now all tracks has the normal internal clock, 120 beats per minute. But one clock is a bit slower. This is the clock from Pamela's workout. You see it here, the bass drum has a bit of different clock. It sounds weird, a bit different clock, and of course you can make very special rhythms with this functionality. We have up to 4 external additional clocks because we have 4 functions. It's always possible to activate these activities by a step. So you can say, whenever a step is set, then please activate this activity. For this, you have this routing functionality. You have this gate mode called routing, RO. And with this gate length, well, it's not matching exactly, you can now route this track to one of these functions. Or, as we've seen before, one of this function and the assigned activity, of course. So, when we have, for instance here, for track number 1, a routing to F1, to function 1, whenever I have here a step, then when this step will be played, then the activity will be activated, and for instance, let's say the activity is roll on track number 3. So when I have now here a set step, then I have this roll effect, but without this step I do not have a roll effect, because now the activity is not activated. And beside of this F1, F2 and F3, I have additional routings, not to these function keys here, but to these keys, to these control keys up here. So for instance, stop. So whenever this step is set, let's start the sequence from beginning. Whenever here is a step, the sequence stops. Stop. So the routing is not to the functions, but to this stop button. And the last routing is reset. So it's nearly the same when I start the sequence here, and when I have here a step on this track number 1, and this track number 1 is defined as gate mode routing, and the routing is reset, then whenever here is a step, the routing goes to this reset button here, and as you see, the sequence resets and starts again. All your work, all information in the system, you can save in so-called slots. You have here 2 functions, recall and store. Let's start with store. If we go to the store function, I see here the slots. You have 30 slots you can use to store your data. Slots already used, you will see here by an LED, and the active slot is blinking. So let's choose an existing slot, this one here, and now you can see here like the name of the slot. In this case it's AAA, and can change this to Chris. So, or just Chris. So this is the name now, and when I press the slot button here the second time, then I store all information in the slot. And this is all information, so the musical information and the settings and everything is stored. And when you restart the system, the last stored slot will be loaded automatically. But of course you can also recall it with this function recall, and now you just press this slot button here. You can choose here all existing slots, and well, in this case you can't change the name, but you see the name here. For instance here this Chris or Demo, and when I press the button the second time, then the data will be loaded. There are 2 very special slots called delete and reset you can use to clear the data. And you will use especially delete very often when you use the system. For instance, you have entered something and you just like to begin from scratch. Then you can go to recall, delete, press again, and the system is cleared. Why we have here two different buttons? Well, first delete. Delete clears all musical information, so the steps and also the track information, but not the system parameter, not the clock, and also the MIDI parameter stays as they are. And reset, this is the second option to clear the system. This reset clears the musical information but also the system parameter. It's stronger than this delete. But both buttons do not delete the existing slots. So the existing slots, they stay there. You just delete or to clear what you entered in the system, and so you can begin from scratch. We have talked about most of the system parameters already, but I would like to go through them very, very briefly. You access the system parameter by pressing Shift System. The first parameter is follow track. The default is 1, so track number 1, but you can also switch off this functionality or choose another track. This track then helps the system to decide what pattern will be shown in the matrix. This is the most important track, and the playhead of this track decides what pattern will be shown. The second parameter is the quantized recording. The default is one step, so no quantizing. And you can choose 2 steps, 3 or 4 steps. The next parameter is live rehearsal, and the default here is 1. This is used if you would like to hear a rhythm or an entry in the library when you choose it or not. Maybe when you play in front of an audience, it's better you do not hear this rhythm during you design it. Copy all, also important for the effects and the library function. This defines if only the steps will be copied to your pattern or also the track length, for instance. Then reset, as we seen before, a sequencer can have different reset behaviors, older and newer. The default is here the newer behavior. Then MIDI on off, MIDI clock on off, voltage out, the default voltage, 5 is the default. You can change this number. Then the voltage of the accented step. Here's the default X, that means 10. Then tuning 1 and 4. These two parameters help the system to tune these tune steps, these notes, these pitches. So this indicates the tuning level for voltage 1. If you output 1 and it's a bit too high or too low, you can change here a little. This helps also the quantizer doing its work. And here tuning level 4, so if you output a level voltage 4, so the C of the octave 4, and it's a bit too low or a bit too high, you can change here with this parameter, this output. It's just a small little change, some millivolts, and maybe then you help your quantizer and the precision is then higher. Game of Life is funny. If you activate this function, the sequencer changes the behavior completely. If you start now the sequencer, let's use here the internal clock again. If you start now the sequencer, the steps will behave like an organism. This is Game of Life, so depending of the neighborhood of the steps, they live or they die, and it's funny to play with this little game. Then we have here the panel. A means the original panel and B means this new panel. It's the small or the big one, but just the new panel. And finally the brightness of the LEDs. So 4 is the maximum, and you have all the levels here of brightness. Okay, I think we covered now all functions of a157b. And this is also the end of the second part of the tutorial. In the third part, in the next part, I would like to use these functions and all this feature to record a little song. Okay, thank you very much for watching, and your feedback is very welcomed.